I'm partially deaf, and I've been partially deaf all my life, or at least since before I can remember. It may have been caused by childhood measles, but we don't know. I only really became aware of my deafness and the degree of it in my 30s when I was sent for audiology testing. And when I first put in a sample hearing aid, I was shocked at how much sound there was in the world, how loud the world was. So I could hear water in the pipes and the trees outside and people passing in a corridor. Before that, it was a bit of a joke in my family that if you called out to me, I didn't hear you. But they thought that was because I always had my nose in a book. And then later I realized I was unusual because I couldn't hear the lyrics of songs, but again, I didn't associate that with deafness. And the other thing I would say is that my deafness has really come in two waves. So until I was in my late 40s, there wasn't a lot of change in it. So I have very little hearing in my right ear, but my left ear was working. But then I gradually lost more hearing in the way that older people often do, so that today I'm really quite deaf. I've been a lecturer and then a professor of English at the university for many years, and I particularly noticed the problems of deafness in two contexts, in meetings and in the classroom. The classroom is often difficult because at Avenue campus, where humanities is largely based, we have very high ceilinged rooms which swallow the sound. I noticed that I was retreating to the front of the room more and more as my deafness worsened, and that I was talking more and more. So instead of having lively interactive discussions with the students and giving them a chance to talk and participate, I was rather dominating it. And I eventually thought to ask a deaf friend in America if he's had this problem. And he said, yes, the answer is to get out into the room, and if you're asking a question and you're afraid you won't hear the answer, which I realized had been my fear, but I hadn't confronted it, the answer is to get very close to the student, ask the question, and then you can have a conversation. You can see their face, see their lips moving. And I did that, and it was astonishing what an improvement it made in my experience, and I think in my teaching. So it was as if I'd put the light on in the room. So what I take from that experience is that there are ways that people who are deaf, teachers who are deaf, can be helped. And it may not be obvious to them what they need to do. That's just one example. The other example I really want to mention is that when you're partially deaf like I am, in certain environments it can be hard to hear. So if there's a noisy fan in the ceiling, or if you're in the staff club or in a cafeteria, there's a lot of background noise. And for a very long time when I was younger, I thought that I was somewhat awkward in these situations, that say 6 or 10 of us would gather around a table and I just couldn't follow the conversations. But I thought this was somehow some failing of mine. It never occurred to me that it was my deafness. It seems odd now, but that was the case. So that's something else I would share with people, and I think it's left me with a sense it's very important for people with a disability to be offered guidance and possibly steered towards further investigation or medical assistance. I think those are the two main things. One other thing I'd say about meetings that you asked me, and that is, obviously they're quite difficult if there's a room with 30 people in it sitting around the edges of the room. It's almost impossible to hear at times. I learned that it made a big difference where I sat. If I sat at the end of a long table, I was much more likely to hear most of the conversation. And if I sat at a corner so that most of the talking was being done, as it were, on my left side, I was more likely to hear. So those are sort of a few of the basic experiences I've had at university. It does mean that if you're partially deaf, you have to often ask people to repeat themselves. And that can take a bit of courage, because it can seem impolite or an example of stupidity. But that's on me. But it's a great help if people recognise that if they're talking to me, it's better to face me rather than turn away, for example. Sounds a small thing, but we all do it all the time. I think that when I look back, I think it would have been helpful for it to have been sort of accepted in my department that I was deaf. I suspect people were kind of aware of it, but it wasn't a sort of spoken recognition. You ask me how people can be who are deaf can be supported. I think the first thing to recognise is that most of us are reliant on hearing aids, and hearing aids have some inherent limitations. They further increase the problem of not hearing the direction of a sound. So most partially deaf people lack some directionality. It's harder to tell where a voice is coming from. So some speakers alerting you that they are the ones speaking, it sounds odd, can be very helpful. We shouldn't assume that the hearing aids can do all the work. I discovered quite late on that there's a device called a Roger pen, which is a portable microphone, which can be placed on a table where people are gathered around, or it can be held in the hand and pointed at a speaker, but it greatly increases the clarity of the sound, because a feature of my deafness, I think, and it's true of most people who are partially deaf, is that we hear sound in a very distorted way. So it's not just lack of volume, but it's the distortion that's the problem. More generally, I think there's quite a lot that could be done. It would help if classrooms with very high ceilings either had some reflective surfaces in them to bring the sound down. It would help to at least make available devices like a Roger pen, perhaps even just they're expensive on the basis of temporary loans. We provide all sorts of other audio-visual equipment. There are devices that deaf people could have. Oh, and the final thing I think is very important, and I think it's a work in progress, is that there could be training for deaf teachers, advice from experts or people from the deaf community. What you asked me, what's my biggest achievement? I'm tempted to say whether or not it's big. I felt that my work on the study of poetry performance was very important. Although poetry has always been spoken aloud and performed either in domestic settings or indeed sometimes in public, very, very little research had ever gone into it. And I became interested in this because I'd been going to poetry readings and finding it hard to hear the poet. So I started asking myself, what's the point of these events? And to some extent naively at the beginning, not really thinking, well, most people can hear it clearly. That led me anyway to some research, and I think I was one of the pioneers in a new and growing field of study of the importance of orality, of the speaking of poetry. Now there are a lot of digital devices that can measure it. The field is really expanding. But I think I was one of the pioneers in that. But it was because I was deaf. You asked me if I have any tips for people who are partially deaf or those who work with them. I guess my main tip is quite simply, if you are partially deaf, investigate it as thoroughly as you can. It's quite easy to underestimate the effect it's having on your performance, your behaviour, and those around you. And I've mentioned that I came very late to the discovery of how deaf I was. I've since read case studies of people for whom that also happened. So that would be my main tip: investigate it. My other tip would be look into possible supplementary devices. Don't just rely on hearing aids. And my other tip would be as bold as you can be in helping other people understand that you're deaf. If they speak in a way you can't hear, ask them to repeat themselves. Don't be shy of that. My tip to colleagues working with a partially deaf person is become used to addressing them face on. It's very helpful if, when you're speaking to them for the first time in a conversation, you address them with a few words that don't matter. So if you say, oh, Peter, that helps identify who you're speaking to. Oh, Peter, let me ask you about this. It doesn't matter if I don't hear those words, but all too often people launch in with the most important bit of information. That they'll say, the new acronym is, and often I won't have heard the acronym, and I won't know what they're referring to.